Is your beard?
Yeah.
Maybe a bit better.
All right.
Cheers.
Ah, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So what with internal people it's 60. Right. Okay. All right.
Yeah. All right. Busy, but that's okay.
Sometimes I put my hand up to get everybody to stop speaking. I just stood here and thank you very much. I'm one of the organisers. There's another organiser here as well. Okay. So, and you'll probably go to the meetup.com site and see other organisers involved. But something like we do tonight. So, thank you for coming along. Can I ask how many people is this? How many first timers do we have here? I'd say it's a good third. Yeah, so welcome. For those that are first timers here, Lean Agile Edinburgh has been going since July 2013, or it was June, anyway, about 4 years. We had humble beginnings in a pub. We used to all gather around, maybe about a dozen of us, and play Lean Coffee, or something's called Lean Lager. We used to influence a networking group to talk about Agile and Lean and so on, and we had very kind of unstructured agendaless meetings, which we still do quite often actually. We actually had one last month where there was no agenda, there was no talks, no speakers, we just came along and we made up the agenda on the night. Today it's a little bit different, we've got a structure for tonight, but essentially what we're about networking and sharing best practice and experiences in Agile and Lean. Okay. Right, so tonight we have we're tonight to be very kindly hosted by Royal London. So I'm going to pass you over to Sandy from Royal London to say a few words about Royal London and the site, and we'll pass you over to Sandy. Okay?
Yeah. Okay. Hi.
Thanks.
So thank you for coming tonight. My name's Sandy, and I'm head of Agile Adoption at Royal London. Not really sure what that means yet, but there you go. So this is our collaboration area at Royal London, and did any of you read it when you came in? It's called Cow Corner. You probably saw Gertie in as you came in. So I don't know if any of you know what Cow Corner is, why it's called Cow Corner? No? So there's a little plaque out there which you might want to read when you go out, but for anybody who likes cricket, which I think is a bit unique in Scotland, isn't it? It's not kind of a game really, is it?
Rounders.
Round. so being a Yorkshire lass, cricket is kind of big, you know. So Cow Corner is the part of the cricket field that really you couldn't get the balls to. So the batsman just, it was just too far in the corner. And it was known as a quiet area because the balls never actually went over there. And they used to have cows grazing in there in the sort of early 1900s. And it was called Cow Corner. It was a place where you could go and you could go and have a picnic and you could go and talk to people. And you were safe with not being hit by a ball. So this is our collaboration area. And you're very safe in here and you're not going to get hit by a ball or anything like that. Why did we want to? This is the first time we've hosted a meeting actually. So next time you come, it'll be water and there'll be no refreshments or anything. So this is our first meeting here. So why did we want to do a meet-up? So we are going through, we're in quite the early stages of a big, and it's quite a sort of saying agile transformation. We're going through what I would call not an agile transformation, we're going through a whole business transformation. So we've got a thing here to say that we want to become more adaptive, inclusive and agile. So we want to change the way we do things, the way that we deliver change in our organisation. And part of that is adapting agile techniques. I would always say that, and I'm sure you've read it, and it's another one of these little things, we absolutely believe that it's about being agile rather than doing agile. We think it's really quite easy, and some of you will say, how dare you say that? But we think actually doing agile techniques and following Scrum or whatever we want to follow is fairly easy. But agile to us, and this is what we decided as a theme for us tonight, agile to us is a people thing. It's absolutely about people, how people think, how people behave, how they collaborate and how they work as teams. So we just wanted to have a bit of fun tonight We've got a great speaker here. We've got Tony here and Stephen will introduce, but we wanted to have a little bit of fun as well and put a little bit of context around the people thing, so we hope you enjoy it. I'm going to hand over just for a couple of minutes to Paul. Paul is one of my colleagues in Roland. Now, Paul is not a people thing. You can see that quite clearly.
Paul's not what?
Paul's not a people thing. Yes, he is. Paul is a very technical thing. So
This is a fine introduction.
you came down and you went, oh my god, there's some video streaming over there, you never told me that. So Paul was actually born with some sort of coding manual in his hand when he popped out, and he is extremely technical. I just wanted to hand over to Paul because he actually believes in this people thing as well. So he's just going to give you.
So I've worked for Royal London, I've previously Scottish Life for 34 years. First time anyone's ever said I'm a technical thing. So I'm taking that as a positive thing. Thank you. I suppose from my point of view, I think we at Royal London, so my role at Royal London, sorry before we start, is Head of Business and Digital Solutions. Like Sandy, I'm still trying to work out what that means, that's 34 years later. So amongst other things, I think the key thing for me is about how do we embed development methods within Royal London. So it's not about saying we have prescriptive methods that we're going to make people follow. It's about how do we introduce a framework that people can then adapt and flex to their own styles. People can work in a different way. But I think as an organisation, there's still certain things we want to try and not retain control of, but try and make sure we get some consistency across the entire group. So things like the tools we use. It would be horrific if we had people in Bath and Lounslow and London and Edinburgh all using different sets of tools to allow us to flex and model. But we want to make sure we've got a framework that allows people to flex their style. A bit of history, I think, if I'm being really honest, we've tried to embed Agile probably a couple of times in the past within Royal London. And we've probably failed each time because it's been an IT initiative. So we've approached it from we as an IT division want to work in a more agile way. And we almost forgot about the business. We forgot about the people side. It was all about the technologies and the processes and the tools. And once we've got these processes and tools in place, it'll be great. We'll be off and running. So we failed. And I think because it was an IT initiative, we just reverted to type every time. So we lasted for maybe a year, 6 months, 9 months. We then reverted back to doing waterfall type stuff, waterfall type delivery, iterative type development. So I think this time it's different though. As Sandy said, this is about, so I firmly believe this is all about people. So process, tools, technologies, it's important and it's really important we get the right tools and technology and processes in place. It's almost as hygiene for me. So it's about people as far as I'm concerned. It's about changing people's mindsets. So I think as Royal London, we're very keen to invest heavily in how we change the way people think, how we change the way people behave. And even simple things like our HR processes in the organisation, we have to flex that. So the old typical way of how do we assess people, how do we reward people, we're looking at the whole ecosystem around Royal London to try and make it successful. Again, things like finance departments or risk and audit departments, we have to work with these guys to say how do we flex the current controls and the current model to make us more effective long term. So we want to invest heavily. We're engaging with lots of different people to try and change people's mindsets, change the culture within the organisation, change the way people work, trying to give people the environments. This is our start for 10 about some environments we can get so people can try and behave in different ways and just hopefully help people on the journey and to be successful for Royal London. I think probably one of the real advantages of having this type of meetup is, if I'm being selfish, it's about maybe putting Royal London on the stage. I think we want to attract people to Royal London. We want to get the best people to come and work for us. We're keen to get the best people to come and help us. So I think we appreciate that we can do this on our own. So we're needing help. We've already sought the help of a number of different coaches who are here tonight. We've got the help of people who are experts in changing the way people think, and you'll hear from all these guys later on. So I think it's really important for me and for us as Royal London to try and get the right people in to help us along. But be mindful of the fact we don't know all the answers. This is going to change, this is going to evolve as we go. So we have to always be agile in the way we are trying to implement agile. So think that's it for me, I think please enjoy yourself tonight. Sandy and I are all around tonight. If you want any more information about Royal London, please come and speak to us. Contrary to what Sandy said, I'm not taking at all, so I have no idea what Andy's going to talk about. So please enjoy it and hopefully have a good night.
Thanks, Paul. So, our first talk tonight, a while ago, who remembers Clark Chine? Yeah. So, there's a number of different coincidences going on here. So, Clark Chine used to work here. Yeah. So, Clark went back to New Zealand just at the start of this year, and probably like he was actually working here at Royal London. Clark didn't know that we were hosting tonight's meetup here at Royal London, but he put us in touch with a friend, Tony, who is actually he's from Ireland, but he's living in New Zealand and has been for the last 5 years.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Clark put us in touch with Tony, and Clark highly recommends Tony as an agile coach and a talker. And so I was trying to arrange where I'm going to meet up with Tony to actually have a chat, etc. And round the corner there's Clark's Bar. Bizarre. So ended up being around the corner of Clark's Bar tonight. So I don't know an awful lot about Tony, but I do know he's been very highly recommended by Clark. I think that will stand in good stead. And Tony's got a history of being agile coaching for a good number of years now. And I'll let Tony explain the rest of his talk. And he gets up. Thank you very much.
Great, so bear with me while I try to get things plugged in and working. Hey. So hi everybody, my name is Tony. I'm an agile coach and consultant with a small group of independent consultants in New Zealand called Nomad 8. So yeah, thanks very much for having me over here, and yeah, if I'm talking too quickly or anything, feel free to throw something at me. So we'll also have some space for questions at the end. So what this talk is going to be about is, well, this won't be selling you a tool or a book or anything else really, or anything patented. This is pretty much just a talk about, I guess, failures, and all namely mine. So sometimes, I guess the Agile community gets a bit of stick, or a bit of criticism for maybe people trying to out-agile each other, which is pretty counterproductive. So this is definitely not that. You will not have that opinion of me that I'm good at probably anything after this, but that's fine. So I began life as a developer, as a bearded developer with hair. That was a while ago. So I was a software developer in a company in Ireland, and I was working on a team and working on a project for about 3 years. So we were working nights and weekends, and like a really tight team, working really, really well. And yeah, so nights and weekends, and at the end of the 3 years, we delivered the thing that we had planned to deliver. It was all actually weirdly, roughly around on time. That wasn't really a problem, and it was pretty much exactly as what we had said we were going to do at the outset. And then we released it to the world. There was about 30 of us working on it, and ultimately nobody really cared. Nobody really bought it or used it, and that sucked. that I don't know if anybody's seen anything like that before, but like that's not a really good environment to work in. That's not a really good feeling. The funny thing was that the company still gave us all the bonuses for getting it done on time, so it was still seen as a success, but nobody outside of us really cared or paid for it or used it. And that was really, really frustrating to me, as you know, you'd be a psychopath really if it wasn't. So that was really, really frustrating, so I decided that project management was the answer. So I went away and paid for myself to study at night for a year to learn all about project management. And went through the course and everything was going well. And we had these guest speakers every now and again who'd come along and, tell us, different methods and different applications. So we had a guy from an incubator in Dublin come along to talk to us, and he said, put your hands up if you work in IT. So it's a few of us, remember just about getting out the gate of like being budding project managers. So put your hand up if you work in IT. So a few of us did, and he said, everything that you've learned is pretty much useless to you. And he began to outline why and his experiences and why he ultimately started working in a more of an agile way. So that was another frustration to add on to the previous frustration. So that made me, it wasn't like all about that, but I left then and I moved off to the furthest side of the world that I could do. And that kind of got me curious in like introducing some, at first there was some kind of practices that I'd seen around Agile, and then ultimately getting a bit deeper into things. So as this is all going to be about failure and learning, has anybody seen this model before? It's a pretty common thing. So it's called the 4 stages of incompetence. So at the base is unconscious incompetence. This is where you don't know what you don't know. Or overconfident Irishman. So then above that is when you start to realize what you don't know, when you start to just have that crap moment. A bit of conscious incompetence. And you know that feeling of I've got a huge amount to learn. Then above that, it's conscious competence once you've started to learn something and and you're in very mindful and deliberate practice. And then ultimately is once that deliberate practice is part of who you are, and once that knowledge is part of who you are, you're not thinking about it while you're doing it. You're not thinking about how to cycle when you're cycling, you're just doing it. So this talk is ultimately about I guess, the different times that I've gone through this loop, and there's been a bunch, and why that's not a bad thing, and why ultimately failure, as we all know, is not a bad thing. And this is part of I guess we were talking about the mindset that you were talking about bringing in. That's, I think that's really core, and a knowledge of that, we don't know everything, but, let's go and find out. So I'm going to use a fictional company to describe this, because obviously it wouldn't really be a great consultant thing to do to come in and crap on any specific company. So all of these things did actually happen, and they're all basically a meld of different organizations that I've worked with. So I came into this organization for the purpose of this. We'll call them a non-corp. And it was like the classic, we've tried to do Agile, somebody read a book, and, that chaos that we've all seen, which was brilliant, because I had gone away in the meantime and done a Scrum Master course, So I'd done my 2 days course and, learned that I could call myself a master at something, which was absolutely great. But I came in and there was a lot of problems that I knew how to solve. There was too much work in progress. Teams weren't talking to each other. There was retrospectives going mad, and either nothing happening out of them or 45 action items happening. And it was a lot of the stuff that you'd see out of a Scrum Master course that you would actually have the tools to solve, which was great. And I felt quite confident. I've never actually said any of those things. I'm inherently uncool, but I felt pretty confident going forward. And these were like the kind of normal bog standard Agile problems, which, as we kind of all know, are pretty much the easy things about the job. It's the people-y things that kind of make things hard. So, like for this, Scrum stuff was actually really, really useful. I don't think Ken Schwaber would thank me for the pictures. I'm not any good at art, but that's fine. So this is when, normal Scrum literature is really helpful for problems like this. So I was in that, I guess, that overconfident point of view and that triangle that you'd have seen. And anybody that's seen any sort of a movie knows what's going to come in next. So we got to a point that we were actually delivering in a sort of a semi-predictable way. The team was working together, talking to each other. I had no hair by this stage. And, things were starting to get better. We were actually starting to deliver software, deliver working software, and, everything seemed like it was going really well. So I was definitely in this unconscious incompetence. Part of what I'd like you to come away with is that the Agile world is massive. There's a huge amount of different roads that you can go down. There's really a huge, unlimited depth of what you can read and what you can get involved in. But I had done a 2-day course, and somebody had said that I could call myself a master at something, so I didn't know any of that. Which is sort of ridiculous that you have a title of Scrum Master after a 2-day course. So I'd like to introduce you to, I'm really proud of this drawing, by the way. This is a resident hippo, and for anybody who doesn't know the acronym, hippo is the highest paid person in the office, or highest paid person's opinion. So this was a problem that I got lumped with. So we had somebody who was one of the founders of the company, a really highly motivated guy, worked 19 hours a day, just frantic. There was 4 teams in the organization at that time, and he said, I'll be the product owner of all of them, and then proceeded to tell everybody. He was an ex-developer as well, which helped because he was able to tell everybody in all the teams exactly what to do day to day. So stand-ups were just became down to a point where it was just him telling people what to do. Everything that we were delivering was exactly to the hippo's specifications. And so, for us getting any further was really, really difficult. Our productivity dropped. Everything really went out the window. Teams, when pressure is put on people, teams started to break down as well. Does anybody have somebody that they've got a picture of in their head at their own organization? Things would be agile if it wasn't for this. Does anybody not have that? Cool. That's true. Everybody will just be blurred out if you did. So the problem there is that that hippo wasn't the problem, or that guy wasn't the problem. I was being the problem at that stage because I had the same picture of this is a person, I was on this side of good, he was on the side of evil, I was on the side of agile, he was on the side of just greed or whatever. I don't know what story I told myself. But I was the problem in that sense. He was just, and all of the people that we deal with, especially those hippos, are just people who are trying to get things done, or generally good people who are trying to do a certain thing. And by taking that us versus them approach, you become the problem. And I certainly did in that case. And we went to holy war, myself and him, and there was massive arguments. But ultimately, we really got nowhere until we sort of came to a point where I started to understand what were the problems that he was trying to solve, what were the needs that he has, and what was our common things that we could work on. And ultimately, I think these are probably some of the most important texts that I went anywhere near. So you can't really be an agile leader unless you can lead yourself, and that takes skills knowing yourself and having some element of self-control before you can move on anything. So emotional intelligence, I think, is the most important skill that we can possess. Any of the agile stuff is generally quite easy, but knowing yourself and knowing how to control your own reactions and being aware of your own reactions, I think is a really, really important skill. Also knowing how to work with other people and how to come to understanding and work alongside people is really, really important. When I say it now, I realize how ridiculous it sounds. And also, this is just a short URL to, like we started putting in health checks around. So has anybody used any of the, like the Spotify type health checks? Another really great way of creating a sort of a safe environment and like bringing up the voices of the teams and allowing them to be heard. And a lot of those were things of bringing up data that I could use and that we could talk about with that hippo to ultimately, free things up and bring us to a better place as an organization. So I felt like I was, at least with this sort of a domain, I was sort of starting to get a bit of conscious competence. I had seen that I had this amount to learn. Read a bunch, and I sort of felt like I was starting to get a bit more okay in that. But yeah, I think that's really one of the most important things is to be aware of yourself and how you're going to be working with others. So things went well, and we were getting to a point. This was our kind of big release point beyond which we'd be making money as an organization. We were losing tons of money before this, as is fairly standard with the startup world. And this was the day that we're going to be switching on fees, and we're all going to be going home to our like champagne baths, and stock prices will be going massive, and we all had huge hopes. So while we were drinking away, I don't know if this is a common pattern that you'll have seen. There's a bunch of work still going on, people doing the actual deployment. I think it's a really, really common pattern across organizations that you've got a bunch of teams doing the stuff, having all the high fives, and then it's just being lumped into some environment. And your operations team are really frequently called a DevOps team, which is the most ludicrous statement that you ever have, is doing all the work of actually getting it into a workable state. So we had a bunch of classic problems that you see from those sorts of things. Our environments were in a complete mess. It was really, really slow for us to do anything. There was not enough like monitoring, because the people that were actually on call were not the people who had developed the things, they were the people who were in charge of the environments, which is a really, really terrible way to be. So not only were they not getting invited to the party, but they also had to do all the cleaning up afterwards. And I don't think this is a super uncommon position. So Scrum talks about having a team that's got all the skills to get something from concept through to done. And does it really count as something being done if you've still got a couple of days work of configuration tasks, if you've got like environments to be set up, like if you've got load testing to be done still, all of this hidden off in some other team. So that has, yeah. So like there are a few different books, but this is all really the kind of, I think ultimately DevOps is about like the actual definition of a cross-functional team, of actually having a team that can bring something from concept through to it being out in the world. It's not just a bunch of tools, but it's actually bringing together that concept of a real team. So yeah, a bunch of things that we had to do was get responsibility for environments and for production software actually onto the teams. So that meant instead of, if there's a bunch of warnings going off on an environment or a production environment, instead of your operations team getting woken up, the team that's actually responsible for it actually got the calls. That means that if you know that you're going to get woken up about something potentially, what you're going to do then is you're going to actually instrument the code properly. So the errors will tell you what's going wrong when you are woken up at 3 o'clock in the morning. So it actually brought in a lot of more positive behaviors. And it meant that there was less crap getting shipped. Might have meant that things slowed up a little bit, but the things that were getting delivered were actually production ready software. So things were going well again. Like I said, we were all starting to picture, champagne, nice cars. Not in New Zealand, actually. It's like a badge of honor if you can keep a car going for 35 years. So it's like, slightly new paint on your old crappy car. But when we released the thing, surprise, surprise, nobody really gave a crap. It all came around to bite me again. So we released and people flocked away from the system. Which was a massive surprise to everybody. And it meant that instead of growing the company and everybody starting to make some money, we ultimately halved and a lot of people lost their jobs. Which sucked. If you've ever been through a large restructure, it's a terrible situation to be in. Because ultimately we didn't just have a single hippo, we had a carefully constructed hierarchy of hippos. Some of the common problems that you'd have seen, like we were doing Scrum perfectly. So we were like, well, why is this happening? We had retrospectives, we had like lovely burn-ups and burn-downs. How can we be in a point that we're having to see like 50% of our friends having to leave the organization? Ultimately, my point to this section is that just doing Scrum perfectly is not enough. All our carefully constructed hierarchy of hippos was telling us to do things that ultimately people didn't really give a shit about, and that was the thing that we needed to address. So it's back down in the unconscious incompetence land. This was stuff that really, Scrum or the Scrum Guide doesn't really set you up for. I was still going around calling myself a master, so I had to figure out how I could bluff that or find out what was going wrong. So does your organization, does that value getting stuff done, getting features out, or does that value changing lives and delivering impacts? So we're all supposed to be here, and our teams are all supposed to be there to change the lives of people, helping people to do stuff better, faster, helping to change the way that they work or the way that they live. Are you measuring that? Or are you more measuring, just outputs and getting things done and getting stories done and a nice clean burn down chart? We were certainly on the latter, and ultimately nobody cared. So that was where it got into, I think impact mapping is a really great tool around looking at the outcomes and the impacts that you're trying to have. And then Lean Enterprise, this is not the last time that you'll see this book up here. I think it's pretty much just that cut and paste just example of how you should run a SaaS organization or how you should run a modern software organization. It's a really amazing book. So we started to realize the things that we needed to do. We needed to be actually thinking about what were the outcomes or the behavior changes that we're looking to achieve. And then we can start to work in a lean way and say, all right, how can we test if we're going to be having those outcomes? What are the ways that we can do instead of having developers work for 3 years, working weekends and nights, and ultimately losing all their hair over a failed project again? So we started to do this, and we started to think about what are the behaviors, the measurable change in behaviors that we can have. But one of the problems that we had, so just to pause there a second, one of the ways that I use to describe, when your gran says what is agile, and you have to explain that and have that conversation for the 17th time that day. One of the ways that I use to describe it is like agile. Instead of having an origin and a destination on a map and planning out your route, agile is much more. It's supposed to be there to be much more of a sat nav. So you're taking a step, then you're making calculations on where you need to be and the environment around you, and then you're making a decision then about what's the best path to go to. So if you hit traffic, you can make a decision about I need to go left or I need to go right. Or if you hit if there's been a crash, you can navigate around that. But the problem is that we were navigating with data that was out of date. We had, and I think this is quite common as well, we had our 2-week sprint cycle, and we'd come up with our shippable increment at the end of that, and then we had another 2-week release sprint. It's effectively a release train, where everything would get munged together. And so then potentially, if you finish something around the start of a sprint, you'd have potentially 4 weeks before you can even start measuring how something is doing out in production. So that's 4 weeks before you can even start. And usually measuring any of these effects takes a certain amount of time. So by the time you're getting any usable data, it's maybe 2 months between when you've finished it and when you can actually make a decision. And you've probably come up with that idea much earlier. So our lead time was absolutely massive. So to do this, we needed to take a look at how we worked as an organization. Lots of things like continuous delivery and working on affecting our lead time. We needed to put our data in the hands of teams. It's a really common problem that that data will not be accessible by teams, even though we all boast big data, but a lot of our teams can't actually access the data to make decisions, and interpreting data is another problem on top of that altogether. So that worked for a while. We eventually got our lead times down, and we were actually starting to make those sat-nav type decisions. But ultimately, after a while, we found that things slipped back. So teams that were doing lean stuff and doing experiments and learning, which is all cool, ultimately got pulled back into doing feature roadmaps. So the problem there was that unless you change as an organization how teams, people, product managers, product groups, how all of those are incentivized and what they're measured around, ultimately people move back into the ways that they're pressured and working. So that's generally feature roadmaps and just get it done, don't bother, because learning takes time. Like analyzing data takes time, experimentation takes time, but shipping out features is very quick. So ultimately we reverted that way. So this led us to, I think, Sense and Respond is an awesome book that really addresses how do you have an agile organization instead of just focusing on how teams work at the team level. How do you as an organization, because it can't just be bottom up, it needs to be top down and bottom up. And that shift is all about how you shift as an organization to value and incentivize the things that really matter. And again, Lean Enterprise, because you should buy Lean Enterprise if you haven't bought Lean Enterprise by now already. And I get no money from any sales of Lean Enterprise. I just really like it. Ultimately, I think we all should be going through this cycle as often as possible. It's okay to be in the unconscious incompetent state once you're trying to work through to getting consciously incompetent as quickly as possible. It's okay to say to clients, I don't know, but let's find out. Clients actually weirdly like that when you do that. I think it's important that you're conscious about going from unconsciously incompetent through to consciously unconsciously incompetent as quickly as possible, which I know all seems very obvious. And then once you go from, once you're unconsciously incompetent, where you know that you don't know what you don't know, right? Yep. I'll take silence as agreement that you're trying as quickly as possible to get through this cycle as often as you can. I guess what you're trying to do yourself is to kind of slowly get better and learn more. Because Agile as a thing seems quite simple, but it's incredibly vast and incredibly deep. So I know that the title made it look like that I was just going to come along and crap on Scrum, which I didn't. But a lot of the point was that it's not enough. So obviously simply read. So one of the first teams that was written about using Scrum was in 1995. And at around that same time, and the British #1 was Nick himself. So I think whereas Scrum is not a bad place to start, I think we should look at teams that are thinking that the Agile world is just Scrum, or organizations that the Agile world is just Scrum, as you'd look at somebody if you walked down the high street and saw them listening to Simply Read. And I think you should encourage them that there's a bigger world of music and Agile out there. And ultimately, that's absolutely everything. So my name is Tony. I'm from Nomad 8. You can tweet me or email me at those details. Thank you very much for your time.
Any questions for Tony?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I'm not sure it makes any sense to anybody else outside of this context. Cool. Yeah, absolutely.
Herding hippos. Could you go about doing that?
Yeah, like I said, the first thing was changing myself, and stopping myself from viewing that person as a hippo, and stopping myself from setting myself up as against that person. I think it's really easy, and you sometimes kind of can get a bit of a hero complex about yourself, maybe from seeing like I'm battling against this force for evil, but I needed to, cop onto myself and realize that I wasn't doing anybody any favors, and that this was just a person, a smart person. You can't really go into anything unless you assume that the person is a smart person who wants to do the right thing. And once I started off from that point and got rid of my own ego and made things into more of a cooperation with them, and figured out, because a lot of the things that we're trying to do are things that actually help people that we perceive as hippos. We just need to find what are our common goals, or what are the things that we need to help them achieve.
So that can maybe try and helping them without putting it in so many words, that they're on that pyramid somewhere as well, and you're going on a journey together. Yeah,
totally. And ultimately helped that some of that pyramid got fired as well. So that kind of decreased the scope of what I had to do. It was very much like forming a collaboration, forming a team and a common goal with them, and making them be part of the change. Like, people don't hate change; people hate being changed, and that was exactly what was going on there.
Any other questions?
Yeah. Hey.
If you arrive in an organisation where an us versus them mentality is already developed and is firmly entrenched, how do you go about reversing that? Because you're coming in as a new person trying to, people have developed these sensitivities over a long time, and how do you go about making them friends again?
That sounds...
Sounds a bit like marriage.
It's a simple answer, isn't it?
It's definitely a 3-word answer. I don't know, 2-word, just run away. No, don't run away. I don't, like in that situation, that it was this guy had it wasn't just me thinking that he was the enemy, but it was also helping other people to realize, other people to have a bit of empathy as well for what the other person was going through, and getting a more of a conversation or an understanding, and like building up. You should never be the person that's owning the change or owning the transformation. It's helping like create a group of the people that are going to be doing the work and are going to be affected, bringing them all along together, just getting people to talk generally.
How do you as a coach know when that time is right to sort of step away? Is there any sort of triggers or just kind of signs that you look for to step away and let that team, you don't want to coach them too much, but how do you know when they're ready for that?
Like a transformation team, is it, or like a team owning that? Yeah, I guess that's a good question. Like ultimately, they're going to be the people doing the work and making the change and involving it. Then, so like I think inherent laziness kicks in, and it's trying to be there to like educate them and like help them along that way, rather than doing all the work myself. Yeah, productive lazy. It's I've justified it to myself really well.
Okay, last question.
You mentioned that Scrum is a good starting point. If you're going to, say, for example, a company who's starting out in an agile journey and trying to change the organisation in an agile way, if Scrum is a good starting point, what would be your next step?
I think if you've got good enough like continuous improvement loops, I think all of that happens by itself. Scrum isn't a panacea, and it's not a solution for everything. It's got its limitations, but if like a team is actually looking at the ways that they work and looking at things around them, it's a really good brief way. It's a framework. Like, it's not a solution for everything. It's just a really light framework. It's only a few pages. It's not like it's designed to be light for a reason. So I once recently talked to a team who had been doing like Scrum like as if you had like chucked it out of a template, and they'd been doing that for 8 years, and like were delighted by it. And a little bit of me kind of broke into a sweat. They hadn't changed or dropped anything, it's a place to be, it's a place to start off, but like, why not drop stuff or change stuff or experiment? We should be experimenting.
Can I just add something to that? To me, the panacea is actually to be agile. Scrum is the framework, but it's the values and principles. And if you're actually at the point where you're realising those values and principles, that's really where you want to be.
Yeah. Like, are you collaborating with each other? Are you delivering something that like people, like that your users want, and that continuously improving?
I tend to revert people constantly back to the set principles.
Yeah.
And that's really what we're aiming to. Scrum, if you start following it, will start taking you along the journey.
Yeah.
But then once you kind of get into your own rhythm, the principles are there to guide you, to take you to where you really want to be.
Absolutely.
And that's that unconsciously competent.
Yeah.
Okay. So, Tony, we have a little policy in Agile Edinburgh when we have speakers that have came from overseas. We have and Tony has came really all the way from New Zealand. You're in New Zealand, what, 5 days ago?
Yeah.
And and actually Tony's came to Edinburgh to give this talk. So, as a small gesture of thanks, in true Scottish style, a little thank you, Tony.
That's
Tony,
brilliant.
thanks very much for talking tonight.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So, we're going to go into the workshop next. Agile Manifesto, in the top value statement, individuals and interactions over processes and tools. And I think we'll probably be hearing a bit more in that kind of area coming up in the workshop. So I'm going to pass you over to Francis and Michael, who are going to talk more about the workshop. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Hello.
So I'll just get this plugged in, same deal, just get the technology plugged in and then I can talk to you a little more. Boom, not quite, nearly there. Is that up there? Still not there? So I'm not going to talk for very long. There you go. I'm not going to talk for very long, so I want to get you guys on your feet, active, doing stuff fairly quickly, but I wanted to introduce the subject. So Michael, who's assisted me today, over the back there, along with a few others are helping out. So Michael and I work with DPA Consulting, and we've been working with Royal London in some of their work in the space of transformation. We've been working with Royal London for a long time as DPA. And the particular area that we specialise in is leadership and development. So particularly within the context of the work around Agile, we've been looking at mindset. And that's a space I hang out in. That's where I'd consider to be my expertise. And so I want to introduce the concept of mindset and talk a bit about what that means, and then we've got an experience that we can play with and explore how we encounter change as human beings. So from the point of view of psychology and the way we see the world, how we encounter change as human beings. So the heading is Agile, it's a people thing. That's what we came up with as a way of framing it from the point of view of the work we've been doing at Royal London. And in all of the conversations that I have with people from the Agile world, Agile experts and Agile coaches, Scrum Masters, over and over again I hear people say, Agile is not a method. Agile's not a method. And I've heard you guys, you talk about that as well, and that's very much feels like the context, that it's not a method, and just as you were talking about a moment ago, it's a set of principles, it's a set of values. So one of the ways we envision that is like this, that at the surface is tools and processes, and you talked, Tony, a little bit in your talk about the way you first encountered some tools, some practices that you tried out. And then at some point, once you've used some tools and processes, you get to a set of practices that aren't just, it's not just something I try out once in a while, but it's something that I do consistently over time that become the kind of rituals that keep us on track. So that's what I might call practices. And then below that are principles. So there's the principles of Agile. And those are much more fluid how you apply them. It's not just a tool that, oh God, if the situation doesn't fit my tool, I don't know what to do with it. It's a set of principles. And below those principles even are a set of values. What do we consider important? What do I want to prioritise? What do I say yes to and invest time in? And what do I deprioritise and say, oh, we're not going to work like that because we don't believe that's right and good as a way of working, as a way of seeing the world, as a way of creating results. Underneath values even is mindset. So often I think when people are trying to go Agile, when organisations are trying to implement Agile, it starts from the outside in, of introducing some tools and practices, introducing some principles if people start to dig a little bit deeper, but you're working from the outside in. What we've been doing with Royal London is helping them to also work from the inside out. So how do we help people to shape their mindset? And mindset is that stuff that often unquestioned assumptions, unconscious assumptions and beliefs that all of us are walking around with in the world all the time. Does that make sense? Yeah. So the problem with unconscious assumptions, as Carl Jung, one of the fathers of modern psychology, said, is that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. So I assume certain things about the world, and I wander about the world expecting that to be true, and of course I spot all the evidence of why that's true, and then that confirms my belief, and I become even more certain of everything that I believed in the first place. and blind to a whole bunch of other options. So if I want to have as many choices as possible in my life, I need to be as conscious as possible of the assumptions I'm making, the beliefs that I'm running. Because if I've not chosen those, if I've swallowed those whole from my upbringing, the people around me, the organisational culture, the collective culture, if I've swallowed those beliefs whole and just assume that those beliefs are truth, then potentially I'm operating with a very limited number of options. And I've edited out many, many other possibilities that could serve me better, that could even be more effective. So if we're going to talk about mindset, let's define it. I find a definition often helps to have a more constructively informed conversation. So there's lots of people who have been talking about mindset, particularly you may have come across Carol Dweck. Has anyone read her book called Mindset? So she's been one of the people who have done a lot of research in this field, particularly in the last couple of years, and she's one of the better known people in that space. She was talking about a specific frame of mindset though. She was talking about fixed versus growth mindset. So what we're often doing in our work at DPA is trying to look at mindset in a much broader frame of what is the mindset frame that will be most useful here. And that's what some of the work we've been doing with Royal London is going, well, if you want to move towards greater organisational agility, what are the mindsets that you need to cultivate that are going to help people to do that are going to help to lay the foundations in people's thinking, beliefs, assumptions and ways of orienting themselves in the world that are going to support that. So if we take a broader definition of mindset, this is a working definition that I find useful. I'm not saying it's the right one, but it's one that I find useful. So a mindset is a constellation of beliefs and assumptions which shape our behaviour in every moment. So it's not just one belief, because actually we're operating under many beliefs all of the time. A mindset is a whole world view, made up of many different beliefs, many different assumptions, but they're also not just nice ideas. It's not my espoused philosophy that I go and tell my friends about to sound clever in the pub. It's actually the way I believe the world works, and because of that it really does shape my behaviour. It shapes the way I make relationships. It shapes even the way I perceive the world. It's like a lens through which I perceive the world. Another way to frame it, which sometimes people find useful, is there's this model called Be, Do, Have, which comes from Walking the Talk by Carolyn Taylor. So if be, your quality of being is who you are, then that to a significant degree determines what you do. And what you do to a significant degree, obviously in interaction with good fortune or ill fortune, but what you do largely determines the results you get. So if you want resilient change, particularly resilient behavioural change, well often in courses people work at the level of skill of what you do. So you get taught new skills on a workshop and you go away very excited, you go away ready to apply them. And what happens? What's that?
You forget it all.
Yeah, right. Maybe for 2 weeks you do really well at best. But fairly quickly, and especially once you get under pressure, you revert to type. And all of that carefully honed skill goes out the window. So if you want long-lasting change, behavioural change, what you've really got to be working is at this level. It's not that you don't learn new skills. Skills are important. But if you haven't shifted the mindset as well, if you haven't had a shift at the level of being, it's going to have relatively little resilience. Whereas if you made a shift in the way you see the world, then even when you get under pressure, you've got a much better chance of going, God, I don't quite know how to do it. I may be struggling in this moment to refine those skills that I learned, but I do feel like there's a better way. Does that make sense? That kind of intuitively makes sense to you? So this is what we're dealing with. When we look at mindset, we're looking at a change at a level of being. And I think one of the difficulties with change more broadly in organisations is often we kid ourselves that we're just asking someone to do something different. I think that's true with Agile as well. We kind of go, oh, we're just asking you to work differently. We're just asking you to do some different things in how you work. Rather than realising that what we're actually asking people to do is orient themselves differently to the world. To see the world differently. To make different decisions and to value different things. Those are quite profound things we're asking people to do, and it's quite a profound shift for people to make. So if shifting mindset is something that's going to be useful to us, how do we go about that? Now, as I say, there's people like Carol Dweck who have done specific research around a particular mindset. something I've found useful is having a framework for how you shift any mindset. Whatever the mindset is that you're trying to shift, there are principles that underpin how you shift a mindset. And again, this isn't about doing something to people. It's not about forcing them to shift their mindset. It's helping them to see where they are perhaps unconsciously incompetent and spot that, yeah, there might be a better way of working. And then people want help changing those things. Most of us would like to change something. How many of you have ever made a New Year's resolution? Yeah? How many of you have also succeeded in that New Year's resolution? So some not. So most of us would like to change something, and it's how you go about making that change. So luckily enough, it fitted into an ABC, which is very convenient for a model. Us consultants like simple and easy to remember models. So this is the frame that I've come up with. So the first step is awareness. First of all, being aware that there is such a thing as mindset. Many of us walk around the world with unquestioned assumptions about the way the world works and don't even realise that we're doing that. That can be a step for many people in the first place. So even realising that I have a mindset, that it's not just the way the world really is, like there's this model in my head and actually that's just the way the world is. What's the difference between the world and the picture I have in my head? So even just spotting that there's a mindset is a thing is a first step. And then being aware of what my mindset is and what the other options might be. That's another step of awareness. So there's these steps of awareness. And one of the interesting things about awareness is when you look at Gestalt psychology and psychotherapy, there's this principle which is the paradoxical nature of change. That's what they call it. Which is that as soon as you become aware of something, it starts to change. So you become aware of it, it's already started evolving once you spot it. Which is the bad news is that it makes it harder to track change. The good news is just by becoming aware of it, you create the possibility for something to shift. So then you can layer on top of that awareness, belief. And the two strands of belief that we work with at DPA, is that first you've got to believe it's possible to change your mindset. Even once you see, yeah, the way I see the world isn't all that constructive, it would be helpful to change it, but I've got to believe it's possible to shift it. And then I've got to believe that it's worth the work, because it's not going to be straightforward. The odds are it's not going to be overnight. It's going to take commitment. So I've got to believe that's a worthwhile commitment to make. And the final step is choice. So once I believe it's possible and believe it's worthwhile, I've got to make the choice to put the effort in and change, to reshape the way I see the world, to shift my perspective, to start to explore the world in different ways and form relationships in different ways and work in different ways. And I haven't just got to make that choice once, I've got to do it over and over again, because all of us backslide. That's in the nature of change, but especially if you're looking at change at a deeper level in our psychology, down at that being level, that I will make inroads into changing, but there is a kind of gravity to how I've been for many years. I've practiced being a certain way over and over again. I've repeated the same behaviours for many years. If I'm going to behave differently, I have to practice not once, but over and over and over and over again until I've formed a new habit. So then we get into a question about how ready you are to change. There's some really interesting research around neuroplasticity and behavioural plasticity more generally. These guys have done some really interesting research. Ben Fletcher and Karen Pine, they're actually a husband and wife team of researchers. They wrote this book called Flex. And what they were looking at is not just how you change a habit, but how could you change any habit? How do you create greater behavioural plasticity so that when you want to change anything, it's easier? How do you get change ready? So we've got some surveys. There's some on this seat here, and there's some people spread around the audience. If you want to grab one of these habit rater surveys, we'll just spread those out. Just grab one and pass them on. And you can answer some questions. There's instructions on there. Answer some questions. So start on page 1, then turn over, and page 2 helps you to then score it so that you know what your score is. No.
Francis, what's the first question?
What's the first question on there? Oh yeah, sorry about that. Let me check it. This question is, how often do you, so it all starts with how often do you do something you said you'd give up? Does that make sense? So that all of the statements start with how often do you? So answer instinctively, just a gut answer. It's okay. I'm not going to force you to reveal this to anyone, and no future job depends on your answers in this questionnaire. So answer instinctively and just go on through. For the live feed, we're going to put some really dramatic music over this. So I can see some of you starting to get to the bottom. So when you got to the bottom, just turn over and you circle the number in the right column for each of your answers, and you can get a score out at the bottom. And then once you've circled all the right numbers in the columns, you add them up and you get a total score. We will be done by 8:15. I won't go over that. All right, so it's sounding like quite a few of you are done scoring. Yeah? So let's, if you've still got some scoring to do, let's time out there. I'll just introduce the next section. You can always finish scoring later and reflect on it a little. So in their book, what Ben and Karen say, what they were looking at is they weren't just looking at changing particular behaviours, they were looking at how able is someone to change behaviours generally. Does someone tend towards being habitual, or does someone tend towards being fairly changeable? So the way they scored it is 0 to 16 on the ratings is less habitual, more open-minded. 17 to 34, a tendency towards routine, and 35 plus equals tried and tested. Now, none of those are inherently good or bad, because like all of these things, there are pluses and minuses of any of them. However, if you're looking at how your capacity, broadly speaking, for changing behaviour when faced with variant circumstances, having a lower score is better. The benefit of being at the tried and tested end of things is that people will tend to experience you probably as more dependable, more predictable, and for many people in many roles that can be a really constructive thing. And should you or your organisation experience a significant period of change, it will mean that probably you'll find that period of change harder to deal with. And if you're looking at agility more generally as an organisational quality, part of the implication of agility is the capacity to change frequently. So there may be benefit in, even if you're more at that end of the spectrum, and that might, like I say, that might suit your role or suit your life and the way you orient yourself, having a little more flexibility may serve you well, almost wherever you are on the scale. I mean, classic example for me is I don't want my airline pilot to be a highly change-friendly person. I don't want to hear. I want to hear the airline pilot come on the intercom and go, "So we're flying at 20,000 feet, and things are all going very well. I've flown this route 400 times before, and it's going exactly as I thought it would." You know, that's very reassuring to me. I don't want him or her to come on the intercom and go, "So I've flown this flight quite a few times. This is at least the 4th now, and I'm thinking we might change things up. So it might get a little bit bumpy, but it's going to be cool." Like, that's not what I want to hear. I imagine you'd all be the same. Boeing 747, that's not fun. So depending on your circumstances, your life, your role, your job, being more change ready might suit you better or worse. But most of us are going to experience significant change in our lives at some point that we haven't necessarily chosen. So having some degree of greater flexibility could be useful. That make sense? Cool. So that's your theoretical answer, having self-scored yourself, and we all know the dependability of psychological tests where people score themselves. So let's test it out. Let's do an exercise and see how changeable you are, how well you deal with change, and what the process is. Not only how well do you deal with it from a kind of scoring point of view, but what is the internal process? What are your thoughts and feelings when you experience change? Up for that? Cool. So, relatively positive sound, so let's take that as a scent. So we're going to do an exercise. I'm going to ask you to get into groups of roughly 3 or 4. We need 16 groups. It'll be roughly 3 or 4, I think, based on the numbers. I'm doing well. So before you do, just pause a minute before you do. I'm going to invite you to already challenge yourself to vary your routines a little bit and maybe work with someone you don't know so well. So to mix yourselves up when you get into these groups. When you're in those groups, so pause. Just let me give you the instructions first. So when you're in those groups, what you're going to do is you're going to come and get from me or one of my helpers a piece of an image. It's one big image, but you're going to have one piece. You're going to have a piece of card that is the same proportions as that image. It's not the same size, it's roughly double the size, but it's the same proportions, so they match. So you have an image and a card, and you'll get some coloured pens. And your job is to recreate the image on the card as best you can, as accurately as possible. get the pieces proportionately in the right place, match up colours. Some of the cards, some of the bits of the image have lots of detail, some less, some of it's quite abstract detail, some of it's easier to spot what it is. Work as best you can in your group to recreate the image on the card, the image on the paper onto the card. Make sense? Everyone understand? Yeah? Cool. All right, so get yourselves into 16 small groups. Should be groups of about 3 or 4. We can redistribute if necessary. So if we have, yeah, so they from your experiences of working in change in organisations, because most of us will have faced some kind of significant change during our careers, or our lives at least, in our families and with our friends, or studying or moving away from home. All of us will have faced significant change, and for most of us that will involve some kind of shift of perspective. Yeah? So feel free to chat about that and reflect about that. It is 8:15 now. So if we can be back here at 20 to 9, so you've got 25 minutes, go and grab some food, have a drink, take a break. Leave your pictures where they are and we'll gather them up. But thanks for diving in, and we'll chat about it a bit more after the break. All right? down. Have a little look at the pictures on the way past, but do come on back and sit down.
What cheese do you use to get beer out of the woods?
What?
Which cheese do you use to get beer out of the woods?
Come on, Bear. All right, so come on back, come and grab a seat. Come on back. Huh?
We're not to look at the work yet.
Yeah, no, you can if you want, but on the way past, that'll be there. Yeah. So come on back, have a little look at the pictures on the way past, but do come on back and grab a seat, please. All right. If I can gather your attention back. So, be interested to hear just briefly a few reflections on how you experienced that. So what did you notice in yourself? Maybe what patterns did you notice as you were doing it, but also maybe what parallels you notice with your experience of working in organisations, of working on change, or experiencing change more generally in your life. So a few reflections, just be lovely to hear back.
It was enforced change
Yes.
as opposed to self-change.
Yes. Absolutely. Yeah.
It felt easier, the second change felt easier than the first change.
Okay, that's interesting. Was that, did other people find that, or did other people? Yeah. Okay, so some nods, some shakes.
First change, I was leaving. Terrible. Like, thank goodness, see you later.
Right, okay.
I had anxiety on the second change because I think I was going to have to come back.
Okay.
So I was glad it was something else.
So this is interesting. So coming back to something you were previously working on, how many of you experienced that, where you've been taken off a piece of work and then had to go back to it when some other people have fiddled and futzed with it afterwards? Yeah? How is that?
Trigger. I'm going to go in the corner here and start.
Okay. So not necessarily. You look like you are.
No. I mean, I suppose it depends on the circumstance, but it could be quite deflating.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
I guess in line with that, after the move, I felt a lot less invested and didn't actually care as much.
Right. That's interesting, isn't it?
Started out actually wanting to do a really good job of it, and then whatever, don't care.
Yeah.
Just do this.
So it's something that we see a lot in organisations, is that people get kind of change fatigue. And especially if people are promised that...
One change is not bad.
What's that?
Fatigued after one change.
Yeah.
Very low threshold.
But even that small amount of change, there's a degree to which you do get invested in something. And if it gets taken away from you, or you're not able to complete on it, or it doesn't get completed in the way you wanted it to, or it doesn't get the results that you hoped for, like Tony talked about with their 3-year cycle of work. And yes, we've got it out, and we've got it out on time, and it's good, and no one buys it. Like, lots of us will probably have experienced that. Even if it's not the customers, it may be an internal thing change that we've been involved in. It just doesn't seem to take. And especially if people have been promised, if a lot of promises are made, this change is really going to make a difference to how we operate. And then it doesn't deliver the things that were promised around it, there can be a kind of learned cynicism. Have you experienced that in yourself or in others? Yeah? So what else? Just one or two other reflections about how you experienced it?
Subverted the task.
Okay. In what way?
Well, I suggested we make some changes to the picture.
Okay. Yeah. The devil makes work for idle hands. Yeah. Oh, right, interesting. So, is that familiar to anyone in an organisational setting?
We noticed we sort of bonded more as well.
We're better as a team.
Yeah.
We see what each of us
Right, yeah. And that's, again, that's something I do see in organisations time and again, is you can end up with these very tight individual teams, but a low level of coordination across the whole piece, because people don't believe in the whole big vision, but they've tightened up in the face of adversity. They've got tighter and tighter, and that's part of how silos form as well in organisations. The silos get tighter and tighter because they want to support each other, and more competitive, so you don't get the overall coordination that allows real performance, but you do get these kind of tight silos. So people feel like, yeah, no, we've got a really strong culture here, but is it effective? Is it really delivering the benefits of being a large organisation or a larger part of a larger system? Yeah. So in some ways it's a silly little exercise drawing some pictures, but hopefully there's some things to reflect on there in terms of what you notice about yourself. Maybe there's been a moment of insight of how you dealt with it personally, and some things to reflect on in terms of what are the parallels between this brief experience, kind of playful experience, and the parallels that you might see in large-scale organisational change. Interesting? Yeah. A little way to explore it. So, a couple more things that I wanted to offer. So one practical tool that we're going to use, but maybe something that you can take away. So one of the ways we've been working with teams, and I've worked with this method with many teams in many organisations, is dialogue. Inspired, not entirely adherent to, but inspired significantly by the work of Professor Bill Isaacs at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. He's done a lot of research, and his group have done a lot of research around how we have conversations and how they shape our experience in organisations. So dialogue is one of the frames around that. And it's a way that we create shared meaning. So looking at how we create shared meaning through the way we have our conversations. So I'll just give a little bit of theoretical introduction to what we mean when we say dialogue, because it's a word we use all the time. But in this specific setting, what I mean when I say dialogue. And then we'll do a little bit of pairs dialogue to have a bit of a conversation around change again. And that will be pretty much the end. And if you've got any questions, feel free to ask them then. So when I talk about dialogue, really Bill Isaacs uses 3 core frames around the different kinds of conversation that we can have. The first of those is debate. And if you look at the Latin root of these words, you can understand very quickly what they really mean. So debate has the same Latin root as the word bat. So I take my ideas, I whack you over the head with them until you agree with me and realise how wrong you were in the first place. Is that familiar to anyone as a form of communication? Yeah, I think it's actually more common than most of us would like to admit, even in our lives. But certainly culturally, it's a pretty normal way of having a conversation. In politics, leadership, organisations, it's I think, kind of sadly common. So that's at one end of the spectrum. There is a healthy version of debate, but it's actually quite difficult to do because it really involves leaving the egos out of the room and fiercely arguing about the subject matter and therefore being willing to change. It's a nice phrase that Bill Isaacs has, which is, if I enter the conversation with an axe to grind, all we can hear is the grinding of axes. I'm not listening to what you're saying, I'm just listening to the grind of the axe in my head until I can get my point across. I'm waiting for an opportunity to speak, I'm not really listening. So the second point on the continuum, the middle, is discussion. Again, there can be constructive versions of discussion. Sometimes it's absolutely the right kind of frame for a conversation. It has the same Latin root as the words concussion and percussion. We take a couple of ideas or a number of ideas, we smack them together and we see what falls out the other end. Now sometimes, especially if you've got basically 2 choices and you need to just make a hard, fast decision, discussion is a great way to go. But if you've got many multiple options, and in the complex world that most of us are dealing with in organisations, complexity means it's rarely as black and white as that. And discussion will often end up polarising the conversation and creating a kind of false dichotomy that we end up arguing about. Can you recognise that as a thing that happens? So if we don't want to fall into that false dichotomy, sometimes discussion can be an unconstructive place to go, or at least an unconstructive place to start. So the other end of the spectrum, if you like, on the 3 points is dialogue. And the Latin root of the word is 2 words actually, is dia and logos, which can be translated as meaning a flow of meaning. So it's not necessarily about coming to a hard decision, although I repeatedly see decisions emerge out of dialogue. not because we were driving with decision, but just because once we've heard different people's perspectives, people find themselves going, we're kind of all basically agreeing about this, aren't we? So it's interesting how that works out. But even if you don't come to a decision, what you will do is you'll hear multiple perspectives in a way that typically involves less judgment and more real listening. And there's some structures that help with that we've been working with the teams. And I've worked with teams over many years. So we're going to do a little bit of dialogue here. One of the principles, also influenced by a woman called Nancy Klein, who wrote a very interesting book called A Time to Think. She was researching how can you help people do their best thinking and came up with some really wonderful principles. Is equal airtime, which actually the research at Google that they did into how you create high-performing teams. They did months of research and came up with almost no common factors between the most high-performing teams. They didn't have the same structures, the same numbers of people, the same ways of working. Like, there weren't very many commonalities. Eventually, after cutting the data to some different ways and researching further, what they found was that there were 2 common factors in all of their most high-performing teams, basically. There's actually one, really, but that broke down into 2 fairly clear ones. One was a high level of emotional awareness in all members of the team. So they were able to track what was going on with each other, not just in their thinking, but in their feeling. And they were spotting, that person seems upset, I wonder what's going on there, or hey, you seem triggered about that, what's the issue here? So they're able to have much more constructive conversations from that place. And the other was equal airtime. So they found that even when one person spoke for 20 minutes of a meeting, the way it worked out when you measured the amount of minutes any given person spoke is on average, they all spoke the same amount. So one of the useful things about dialogue is it's a structured way of working that helps to promote equal airtime. And that's another one of the reasons why we've been working with it. So let's do a little bit of that. So just turn to someone near you. So you're getting into pairs. So you just need to have a pair that you can talk to. And then I'll give you very brief instructions on how to do this. That's all right. That's a pleasure. Oh, that's a pleasure. All right. So this conversation, and it's going to be a brief and focused conversation, but hopefully a rich one, is about personal agility. So for some of you, you'll be working in organisations, and there'll be rich stuff about organisational agility that you could talk about. But for some of you, it may be more relevant personally if you're not in that organisational setting. So we're going to focus on personal agility because hopefully that will be relevant for all of you. The way you focus dialogue is with a question. So you use a question to focus the conversation rather than a decision that we have to make or something like that. So between the two of you, one of you is going to speak first and one of you is going to listen first. So just hand up one of the pair who's going to listen first. You're both going to get a go, so it doesn't really matter. All right. So if you're listening first, your job is to make sure this doesn't turn into a two-way conversation. Your job is to help the other person to do their best thinking. And the way you're going to do that, and this is also how we ensure equal airtime when it's just working in pairs, is you're going to say your partner's name, ask them the question that I'll put up in a minute, and then just listen. Give them your full, as best you can, giving them your full undivided attention. So you're not interjecting, you're not redirecting with your own questions. This is about them doing their thinking. It's not about you steering the conversation to the bit you got interested in. Yeah? So it's really about giving them your full undivided attention to help them do their best thinking. If they seem to have, often what happens is people get, maybe a minute in, and you're just going to have a couple of minutes on it. They get maybe a minute in and then seem to have run out of things to say. But if you sit with that, usually they'll pause and then they'll get to another layer of their own thinking. So you start to reveal different layers of thinking rather than getting stuck at the first layer. That's the problem, is I get interested in something you said and then I redirect you within that first layer and you never get to your second layer of thinking. Yeah? So that's the opportunity here. If they really seem to have got stuck, you can ask the question again or say, and what else? And that's not intended to be a smart-ass thing to say. It is a prompt, it's a nudge to help them to tip back into their own thinking. because there's a habitual looking to the other person to see if they're interested. Yeah? But so it's just a nudge to go on, back into your own thinking. This is your time. All right? So with your partner, the person who's listening first is going to say your partner's name and then ask the question, where in your life would you like to shift your mindset and create more flex? It's a little bit of a chance to reflect about something, how you might apply some of what you learned tonight. All right? Go ahead, say your partner's name, ask the question, and then just listen. she found that one of the things that help people do their best thinking is appreciation. And there's been lots of interesting research actually about, for us to feel psychologically buoyant, what's the proportion of appreciation to constructive or criticism, effectively. I sometimes say strokes to pokes. Maybe that's one best left alone. But what's the balance that we need of positive affirmation as against criticism or what we could call constructive feedback? And the average, there is a range, but the average is around about 5 or 6 to 1. So how many of you think you get 5 bits of positive feedback for every 1 bit of negative feedback that you get in your life? Yeah, so I think generally speaking, there's a way that most of us particularly in the UK, because I think we're a pretty dour bunch in terms of saying if in a full way saying thank you. I think most of us are kind of a bit appreciation poor, so it doesn't hurt us to have a little more in our lives. So I'm going to invite you now with this partner, and we make assessments about people the moment we spot them in a room, the moment we meet them. So all of us will be able to say something about this partner. It could just be about the way they just listened to us, or something that they said that we go, oh, you know, I really appreciated the way you said that. That's something that's important to me too. Yeah, I'm going to invite you just for a couple of moments to offer an appreciation to your partner, for you each to offer one to each other. All right? And if it helps, you can start with the sentence, "What I appreciate about you is," and then finish that sentence. All right? So just a couple of minutes, a brief appreciation each. Make sure you both get to speak and listen. Go ahead. So one of the reasons I wanted to drop that in is partly because it is part of the dialogue method as we work with it, but also because something I see not just in working in Agile teams, working with Agile teams, but also working with other forms of self-organising or self-managing teams, is when you haven't got a hierarchical manager, is there are things that the hierarchical manager does implicitly, if they're doing a good job, that get dropped because no one picks them up. And appreciation can be one of them. Feedback more generally, actually, because no one wants to take responsibility for being the person who goes and says to that guy who's not very effective or being a bit difficult in meetings or whatever else. Who wants to pick that up if it's not my job? So in self-organising systems, making sure you pick up all the, not just the explicit tasks of management, but the implicit tasks of relationship management can be one of the trickiest things to do well. And I think appreciation is often one of the ones, even if the constructive feedback does get picked up because you want to make sure the team's working, appreciation is one of the ones that can just go by the wayside, and over time that is going to take a toll on the quality of the team relationships. So to bring it back to the Agile frame, I did want to drop it in that context too. Does that make sense? You guys have a sense of that? So just briefly, because we are kind of up to time, but if you've got any questions or thoughts about particularly how you see some of the stuff we've been talking about, reflecting on and experiencing, playing with, how you see that turn up in that Agile environment, in your work with Agile and Agile teams. Just be interested to kind of bring it back to that frame and land it in that way, if you've got any one or two thoughts.
Just repeat that.
If you have any thoughts or questions, but I was thinking particularly thoughts about how you see any of the stuff we've been exploring turn up in that agile frame, in that agile environment.
Is it a bit of a cop-out to say, oh, you know what, we should praise people more? I know, we'll set up a Yammer group for that.
I think it can be, yeah. I've seen digital solutions to that kind of stuff work really well.
But if you're co-located,
then...
and you've just sent an email praising people and you're in a meeting
yeah.
and that doesn't get mentioned.
Yeah. Yeah.
That wasn't me, by the way, but...
Yeah. A friend of mine... a friend of mine has a problem with... yeah, I think... for me, there's got to be a balance between how do we do this thing that for many people is uncomfortable and unfamiliar, and make it safe to do that. And it may be, certainly I have seen some teams where even co-located environments, appreciation by email is just much more comfortable for the giver and the receiver, and it works. And I've definitely seen places where it becomes a tokenistic, yeah, it's like a like on Facebook. It really has so little weight, it's meaningless. So I think that's, for me, does it communicate a weight of import? You know, does it really communicate the value of what you did for me or what you've done for the team? If it does, then okay. But if it becomes token, then yeah.
It's not something then there though, and I guess like all good agile mindsets is about shortening your feedback loops. That there's more value in praise when it comes immediately rather than
absolutely,
a day later.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely, yeah, yeah.
Even if it is a token, it's still beneficial.
Yeah, it's better than nothing, right? Yeah, yeah.
I found sometimes that, like as a product owner in a Scrum team, going back to the team even like months later and saying like, remember that thing that you worked on months ago? This is how it's going now, and it helps them to remember that you haven't forgotten that they did all this work to create this thing. That just once they finished it, it hasn't gone out and it's somebody else's now. That they did that, and celebrating that and keeping them up to date with it and things can be really positive.
Yeah, something I was talking to someone earlier about is that you can end up with a big distance between the people who do the work and the people who benefit from the work. And again, the more you can kind of shorten that distance, even if it's not in time, if it's in a sense of proximity to the value. So even if I am a long way from the customer who benefits from it, if someone helps to bring home to me, this customer really, this person, this user really benefited from that thing you built, that can be massive for people about feeling a sense of meaning and purpose in their work. Yeah.
Francis?
Yeah.
You're talking about appreciation here. Is it a problem when you appreciate the outcome? In this instance, you talk about the outcome being 6 months later. But actually, it's much easier to appreciate behavior because behavior is kind of instant.
Yes.
So do you think there's a difference between, should we be careful about saying thank you for behavior as opposed to thank you for outcome?
Yeah, I would see them on a continuum. So I think they all have their place, as those examples show. For me, appreciation for outcome, it can often be almost the poorest form. Appreciation for behaviour is one better because it's that much more personal. Rather than thanks for the tea you made me, it's thanks for the care that you showed in making me that tea, right? So that's one step up the line. And then the furthest step up the line is valuing the person. So rather than it being about you did the thing for me, it's I really appreciate the quality of care in you. I see that you're a really caring person. I really appreciate that about you. That's personal, right? That means something. Much more than thanks for that cup of tea. But they're sort of the same thing, but we've gone back up the chain until it's as personal as possible and really about them. Does that make sense? Yeah.
How would you view what I would term praising plagiarism? So example, you carefully wordsmith a praise, but maybe you haven't got permissions to put that on a Yammer feed. Just let's.
I'm noticing a theme.
And let's say that that individual who does have permissions to post praise on that Yammer feed then takes that carefully crafted piece of wordsmith and then copies and pastes it word for word and doesn't attribute to anyone other than themselves.
Yeah.
Hell is the one of your work.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm aware of when I need to hand back and draw this to a close. It sounds, if I'm really honest, pretty awful. That's my take on it. But yeah, if you've got further questions, Michael and I are around from DPA. If you want to have a chat to us afterwards, feel free to be in touch. But hopefully that's been valuable to you, and we've explored some things in a slightly different way, perhaps, than usual. Thanks for your attention.
Big thanks to Francis and Michael, that's great. Thank you very much for the workshop. Before I wrap up, Isabel Langdon, who is the Chief Executive of Royal London, is going to say some words.
Okay, so I realise we've overrun, so I'm not going to say an awful lot. Just a couple of things. First of all, and obviously it follows quite nicely on the appreciation thing, but thank you so much for coming this evening. It really is appreciated by us because we're on the start of our kind of scaled agile journey, and therefore being able to share things with people that have done this stuff is really important. We're really firm believers that this is as much about people as it is about the process and the methodology, and it's really important to us that we learn as much as we can, so thank you so much for that. I understand from Jen that some people were saying, what are Royal London? What do we do? So just quickly, we're a life and pensions company, so we manufacture pensions, and that's for workplace pensions and individual pensions, and then also protection products, so life cover, critical illness, income protection, that kind of product. We don't sell it directly ourselves. I look after the intermediary division here, which is here in Edinburgh and partly in Wilmslow. We sell through independent financial advisors. So we're quite a traditional company. We're a mutual, so we're owned by our customers. So another attraction of Agile for us is its customer centricity and the sort of outside-in view that it gives us. So that's really important. Being customer-owned, it means we've only really got one master, so that's both a luxury and an obligation, because we're spending real people's money, and so it's really important to us that we spend it wisely. We've been around for 150 years, nearly 160 now, I think, actually. So we are a traditional financial services company. So this is us really trying to think forward for the future and make sure that Royal London's around for another 150 years. And we realise that in order to do that, we're going to have to change. Our competitors are changing. We've got a lot of fintechs and insurtechs coming into the world. At the moment, we've got more expertise in our field and more of a reputation, but they'll build it. So we need to build some of their skills as quickly as we can to make sure that we can continue to compete and continue to deliver what our customers really want. So that's what we do, and thank you so much for helping us on our journey. It's really appreciated. Thank
you. So next meetup, venue, we might be changing the venue for the next meetup. I don't think we've actually announced where the next venue is anyway, so it might be different. So just basically watch the meetup.com site for the details of the next meetup. On that note, we're always asking again, we're trying to make this as interactive. We encourage feedback. So any feedback on tonight's session and in general, please, you can contact any of the organisers or go meetup.com and post something there, or send us an email. We appreciate some feedback and also ideas and suggestions for future meetups. We're also always calling out for any people who want to do a talk or do a workshop, or that talk can be from a really short 5-minute lightning talk right through to a longer talk, half an hour, and so on. We're always really welcoming any suggestions and so on. I know there's quite a few in the mix that we've kind of got been put forward, but keep them coming. Good. Okay. So I think that's it for tonight. So I'd like to say a round thank you. So thank you to Tony for a talk tonight. Yeah. Thanks, Tony. Also thanks to Product Forge for the live stream. It's great. big thank you to Royal London for hosting the event tonight. Much appreciated. It's been a really great venue and lovely refreshments and drinks. Thank you very much. But also for putting on the workshop with Francis and Michael. It's been, I think, a very interesting workshop, and everyone's really enjoyed it. And a big thanks for everybody. Have I missed any thank yous? No? You got it? Yeah. No. Well, thank you all for coming along. This is our thank you. Much appreciated. I think some of us, we're all going now, but I think some of us are going round the corner to Clark's Bar. Yeah, as mentioned earlier. So if anyone wants to join us, it's in Dundas Street round the corner, Clark's Bar. There's many more refreshments and stuff. Well, have a good night. Thank you very much. Thanks.